There's something about new beginnings that feels both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. I had just moved to the city a few days ago, a decision driven more by professional ambition than anything else. It wasn't that I hated my old life. It was quiet, predictable, settled. Too settled, maybe. I'd been living in a small town on the outskirts of the city, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. But now I was ready for something new, ready to make my mark. The job offer had been too good to pass up, a stepping stone, I told myself, to bigger things. So I packed up and moved into the city, leaving behind the peaceful, almost claustrophobic life of my old town. My apartment was small but comfortable, wedged between two towering buildings that made me feel like I was constantly under the weight of the city itself. I was alone, and yet I could hear the hum of life around me, people passing by on the street below, cars honking in the distance. On my third night in the city, some of my new colleagues from work invited me out. I thought it was the perfect opportunity to loosen up, to get to know them better, maybe even make a few friends. We met somewhere downtown, a place bustling with life, the neon lights flickering overhead as we walked through the streets, laughing and joking. They were a friendly group: Chris, the loud one, always cracking jokes; Elena, who seemed quieter but sharp, with a biting sense of humor; and Jason, the one I had connected with the most, someone who seemed just as out of place in the city as I felt. We walked through the crowded streets, the glow of shop windows and bars casting long shadows on the pavement. "We should find a place to sit," Chris said at some point, stretching his arms out and yawning dramatically. "I could use a drink." "Yeah, somewhere with good food," Jason added. "I'm starving." We wandered for a bit, passing one packed bar after another, none of them quite what we were looking for. We weren't in a hurry, though. The night was young, and the conversation was easy. At some point, as we turned a corner, I heard something. A faint sound coming from an alleyway between two tall, grimy buildings. It wasn't anything clear, just a sound, like a low hum or murmur. I turned my head toward the alley, squinting into the dimness. "Hey, hang on a sec," I said, almost to myself, stepping away from the group. I glanced back at them, but they were too absorbed in their conversation to hear me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took a few steps into the alley, peering into the darkness. Nothing. Just a narrow passage lined with dumpsters, the walls grimy and damp. But there was something about it that felt off, something that tugged at me. I kept walking, thinking I would just take a quick look, then head back to my friends. But the farther I went, the more twisted the alleyways became. The straight path I had entered was suddenly full of turns, leading me through narrow, winding back alleys that seemed to shift with every step I took. I should have turned around. I should have called Jason or one of the others. But for some reason, I kept going, half amused and half annoyed at myself for getting lost in the maze of alleyways. By the time I realized just how deep into the back streets I'd wandered, it was around 9 p.m. The buildings loomed tall above me, blocking out the sky, and the alleys grew darker, more oppressive. I reached for my phone, thinking I should probably call one of my colleagues, maybe let them know where I was, or at least make up some excuse for disappearing. I didn't want to admit that I had gotten lost. As I scrolled through my contacts, a green, dim light caught my eye. I looked up and saw, in the distance, what appeared to be a small sign illuminated above an entryway, barely visible in the narrow alley. The light flickered, casting strange shadows against the brick walls. Curious, I walked closer, squinting as the sign became clearer. The Lost Bar. I couldn't help but chuckle at the name. Fitting, I thought, given the labyrinth of back alleys I'd wandered into. Still, it was intriguing. A hidden bar tucked away from the busy streets? With a name like that? I figured it would be worth checking out. Maybe I could invite my colleagues over, making it seem like I'd found something special instead of just admitting that I'd gotten lost. I stepped up to the door and pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly as I entered. Inside, the bar was cozy, almost unnervingly so. It felt like stepping into a different time. The lighting was dim, casting everything in a warm, amber glow. The decor was vintage, old wooden furniture, dusty chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and a jukebox in the corner softly playing music I couldn't quite place. It was like something out of a dream, or maybe a memory. I approached the bar and took a seat on one of the tall stools. There were other patrons scattered around the room, but no one was talking. They all seemed focused on their drinks, lost in their own worlds. The air was thick with an odd sense of familiarity, as if everyone here knew something I didn't. The bartender, a tall man with graying hair and a face that seemed carved from stone, stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with slow, deliberate movements. He didn't acknowledge me at first. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts again, ready to call Jason and tell him to come check this place out. Just as I was about to dial, a deep, gravelly voice broke the silence. "What do you think you're doing?" I looked up, startled. The bartender was staring at me, his face expressionless, his eyes dark and unreadable. I hesitated, thrown off by his tone. "I'm just calling my friends. I thought they might want to join me here." The bartender's gaze didn't waver. He set the glass down and leaned against the bar, his voice low. "Look, kid, we have some rules around here." I raised an eyebrow, half amused by the idea. "What, like no phones at the bar or something?" The bartender didn't smile. He didn't move. Number. Not that kind of rules. There was a long pause, the air in the bar growing heavier. "First rule," the bartender said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You can't seek out the bar intentionally. It only appears when you're lost, physically or emotionally. If you tell anyone to find it, they never will." I waited for the punchline, expecting him to crack a smile, but his face remained completely serious. I couldn't help but laugh a little, trying to brush off the tension. "Right. Got it. Sounds fitting." Ignoring him, I continued with my call, telling Jason about the bar. I described the place, the vintage decor, and the overall vibe, hoping to pique his interest. Jason, however, was confused. He said he'd never heard of any bar like that downtown, but told me they'd come meet me anyway. As soon as the call ended, I started looking around more carefully. Something was off. The patrons, all of them, looked like they were from different eras. A man in a sharply tailored suit that looked like it belonged in the 1940s sat by the window, sipping a drink. A woman in a vintage dress, maybe from the 80s, sat in a corner, staring at her glass. The more I looked, the more I realized just how out of place everyone seemed. Like they didn't belong to the same world, let alone the same decade. An uneasy silence filled the room, thick and oppressive, as though everyone knew something I didn't. Something terrible, something none of them would acknowledge. I was shaken from my thoughts when my phone rang. It was Jason. His voice sounded annoyed, like he was done with the joke. "There's nothing here, man," he said. "We've walked up and down the alleyways and there's no bar, no sign, no lights. Are you messing with us?" I frowned, my stomach knotting as a wave of confusion washed over me. "No, I'm serious. I'm sitting inside right now. It's called the Lost Bar. You can't miss it." "Dude, I don't know what to tell you," Jason replied, the frustration clear in his voice. "We're standing right where you said, and there's nothing here." Something cold crept up my spine. I glanced around the bar again, noticing the way the patrons seemed to move in slow, deliberate motions, as if time didn't matter to them. "I'll come outside and—" Before I could finish my sentence, a hand landed on my shoulder. It was the bartender. His grip was cold, almost unnaturally so, and when I turned to look at him, his expression was completely flat, devoid of emotion. "Second rule," he said, his voice a low growl. "Under no circumstances should you leave the bar before midnight. The bar has its own schedule. If you try to leave before the clock strikes 12, you'll find yourself unable to return to the life you knew." My heart pounded in my chest as the weight of his words sank in. I tried to brush it off, tried to convince myself that this was all some elaborate joke, but the unease in the air was undeniable. I glanced over his shoulder at the clock hanging on the wall behind the bar. It read 10 p.m. This was ridiculous. I shook my head and lifted my phone to my ear again, ready to tell Jason that I was coming out. But as soon as I brought the phone to my ear, all I heard was static. Something wasn't right. I looked back at the bartender, and that's when I saw it. His face had changed. The skin on his cheek stretched unnaturally, his grin widening to an impossible degree. His eyes, where his eyes had been, there were now dark, empty voids. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind reeling. I turned away from him, desperate to escape the sight of his twisted face, only to realize that every single patron in the bar was now staring at me. Their faces were blank, their eyes emotionless, but their heads all turned in unison, following my every move. I managed to get off the bar stool, my legs shaky, and began slowly making my way toward the door. I didn't dare run. I didn't dare make any sudden movements. The eyes of the patrons stayed fixed on me, their expressions unwavering, expressions never changing, their gaze piercing through me like knives. As I reached the door, I heard the static on my phone again. It crackled in my ear, a low, distorted sound. But beneath the static, I heard something else, a voice, the bartender's voice. "Third rule," it said, low and distorted. "Never look at the clock. Time doesn't move the same inside the bar. If you look at the clock, you'll begin to notice things around you, like faces shifting, patrons vanishing." My mind was spinning, my thoughts racing. I slowly turned back toward the bar, my eyes landing on the bartender once again. His face had returned to its previous state, calm, unreadable. But I could still see the flicker of that grin, the hint of something terrible lurking beneath the surface. This wasn't a joke. I stepped away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not before midnight. I walked back to the bar, my head down, avoiding the gazes of the patrons, avoiding the clock. I could feel the weight of their stares, the way their eyes followed me as I moved. But I didn't look at them. I didn't dare. I sat down again, my hands trembling as I rested them on the bar. The bartender turned to me, his expression as neutral as ever. "Kid," he said slowly, "you've broken the rule. Every rule you break has consequences." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "But you didn't tell me the third rule in time. How could I know?" The bartender's lips curled into a faint smile. "You didn't let me finish talking." I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I looked around the bar again, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of it all. The patrons had gone back to their drinks, their conversations, as if nothing had happened. A slight feeling of relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The bartender reached under the bar and pulled out a small, yellowed piece of paper. He scribbled something down on it before sliding it across the counter toward me. "These are the rest of the rules," he said, his voice calm. "You'd best follow them." I picked up the paper with trembling hands and began to read. "Fourth rule. If you see my reflection in the bar mirror, don't speak. Fifth rule. If an old man sits next to you at the bar, you should always offer him a drink. Sixth rule. If the entrance door opens on its own, don't look. Seventh rule. Never acknowledge the woman in the red dress. Eighth rule. Don't turn around if you feel someone tap your shoulder." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I read the final rule. I didn't know what any of this meant, but I knew one thing for sure: I didn't want to find out. I glanced back up at the bartender. "What's the deal with the woman in the red dress?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The bartender's expression darkened. He leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "Every now and then you may spot a woman in a faded red dress with pale skin and black eyes sitting at the far end of the bar. No one else seems to notice her. If you look directly at her, she'll stare back. She'll smile, stand up, and approach you. If you speak to her, she'll follow you wherever you go, even after you've left the bar. She never stops following. My skin crawled at his words, my stomach turning with fear. I sat back in my chair, trying to process everything. My mind was reeling, and I needed something, anything to calm my nerves. "I'll have a whiskey," I muttered, my voice shaky. "On the rocks." The bartender gave a slight nod and poured me a glass, the ice clinking softly as he slid it across the bar. I took a long sip, the burn of the whiskey spreading through me, though it did little to calm the panic swirling in my chest. As I sat there, nursing my drink, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. The bar mirror. The bartender's reflection. I froze. His reflection wasn't right. It wasn't him. It was something else. The reflection contorted, twisting into strange, unnatural shapes. The bartender's face stretched and distorted, his eyes empty, hollow. His grin was wide, impossibly wide, and his reflection was staring straight at me, through me. I felt my heart skip a beat, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't look away, but I knew I couldn't speak. Don't speak. With a great effort, I tore my gaze away from the mirror and stared down at the bar, my hands trembling around my glass. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't break the rule. I took another sip of whiskey, trying to steady myself, trying to pretend like everything was normal. But nothing was normal. I needed to stretch my legs, to get away from the mirror, so I stood up and wandered a few steps away from the bar, careful not to glance toward the reflection again. After a few moments, I heard something. A faint tapping sound, like someone drumming their fingers on the bar. I turned toward the source, and there he was. An old man sat at the bar, hunched over, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, his hands resting on the bar in front of him. My heart raced as I remembered the fifth rule. If an old man sits next to you at the bar, you should always offer him a drink. I didn't hesitate. I rushed back to the bar, my mind screaming at me to obey the rule. "What would you like to drink?" I asked, my voice barely steady. The man didn't respond. He didn't move. For a long, agonizing moment, I thought I had done something wrong. But then slowly the old man turned his head toward me, revealing hollow black sockets where his eyes should have been. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, I heard a distant, echoing scream, building in intensity until it filled the room. Panic surged through me, but I didn't falter. I grabbed my own whiskey glass and slid it across the bar toward the old man. The scream stopped. The man turned back to face the bar, the black voids of his eyes staring straight ahead, as if nothing had happened. I looked around the bar, but the other patrons hadn't reacted at all. They were still minding their own business, as if the old man and his scream had never existed. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to leave. I turned toward the door, knowing that midnight was approaching, but unsure how much time I had left. I glanced at my phone, hoping to check the time, but the screen was black. It wouldn't turn on, no matter how many times I pressed the button. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to the bartender. "What time is it?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The bartender's eyes locked onto mine, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said softly. "You followed the rule." He paused for a moment, then added, "It's 11:30 p.m. Relief flooded through me. Just 30 more minutes. I could make it. I could survive this. The clock on the wall continued to tick away in the background. It sounded strangely muted, as if it was coming from somewhere far off, even though I knew it was just behind the bartender. 30 minutes, and then I could leave this nightmare behind me. I asked for another glass of whiskey, and the bartender obliged. I took a sip of my whiskey, trying to calm the trembling in my hands. The warmth of the alcohol did little to ease the knot of fear tightening in my chest. My eyes flickered toward the mirror behind the bar, but I quickly averted them. The reflection of the bartender, contorted and wrong, still burned in my memory. I glanced at the patrons around me. They were all still absorbed in their own worlds, their expressions distant, their movements slow and deliberate. It was like they were moving through water, stuck in some kind of suspended animation. But even now, none of them seemed to acknowledge my presence. None except for the bartender. I drummed my fingers against the bar, forcing myself to breathe slowly, trying to keep my thoughts grounded. I needed to focus. I couldn't afford to break another rule. One more slip-up, and I didn't know what would happen, but I knew it wouldn't be good. The bartender's voice echoed in my head. Every rule you break has consequences. My mind drifted back to the list he'd given me. The rules were burned into my brain, etched into my thoughts like a brand. Don't look at the clock. Don't speak if you see the bartender's reflection. Don't turn around if someone taps your shoulder. Never acknowledge the woman in the red dress. I exhaled shakily. 30 minutes. That was all. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. She sat at the far end of the bar, almost hidden in the shadows. Her dress was deep red, faded like it had been washed too many times, its color dulls in the dim light. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and her long black hair cascaded down her shoulders in soft waves. A chill crawled down my spine as I turned my gaze back to my drink, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on the room, thickening the air with an almost suffocating heaviness. My hands tightened around the glass as I tried to remind myself of the rule. Never acknowledge the woman in the red dress. I took a slow, deliberate breath, refusing to look back at her. I didn't dare turn my head even a fraction, but I could feel her staring at me. I didn't know how I knew. Maybe it was the way the atmosphere seemed to shift, the way the energy in the room changed. The silence became heavier, more oppressive, like the very air was holding its breath. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my pulse quickening. I had never felt this kind of fear before. This wasn't the fear of something you could see, something tangible. This was the fear of the unknown, of something you couldn't explain, something lurking just beyond the edge of reality. I kept my gaze locked on the bar, pretending to study the worn surface of the wood. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Why was she here? Had she always been there, waiting, watching, hidden in the shadows until now? Or had I somehow drawn her attention by breaking the rules? The seconds felt like hours, dragging on as the tension in the air grew thicker. I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore, the sense that something was coming closer, creeping toward me from the far end of the bar. My skin prickled as if 1,000 tiny eyes were watching me from the darkness. I didn't dare move. I barely breathed. The soft creak of wood echoed through the bar, a sound so faint, so subtle, that if I hadn't been on edge, I might not have noticed it. But I did. She had shifted in her seat. My heart pounded louder in my chest, and I forced myself to stay still. Don't look. Don't acknowledge her. It's just a trick, I told myself. It's just the bar trying to mess with you. But then I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from the bar this time. It was coming from her direction, like fingernails lightly tapping against the wood, an almost absent-minded rhythm that sent chills crawling up my spine. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, filling the silence that hung heavy in the room. My pulse quickened. Sweat began to bead on my forehead. Every instinct screamed at me to glance over, just a quick look, just to make sure she wasn't moving closer, but I didn't. The bartender had warned me. She never stops following. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like she was trying to draw me in, trying to force me to break the rule. I clenched my fists so tightly my knuckles turned white, fighting the overwhelming urge to look. Then suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the entire bar had gone still, waiting for my next move. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind racing. Maybe she was gone. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had passed the test. But then, from somewhere just behind me, I heard a soft, almost melodic voice. "Would you like to dance?" My blood ran cold. It was her. Her voice was smooth, like velvet, and yet it felt wrong. Too soft, too inviting, like a predator luring its prey. My heart pounded so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The air grew colder around me, and I felt her presence closer now, much closer. My skin crawled as I sensed her standing just a few feet behind me, waiting for me to acknowledge her, waiting for me to break the rule. Don't look. Don't speak. My mind repeated the mantra over and over, clinging to it like a lifeline. I gripped the edge of the bar, my nails digging into the wood as I fought to keep my composure. "Would you like to dance?" she asked again, her voice softer this time, more intimate, like a whisper against my ear. I could feel her breath on the back of my neck, the cold, icy breath of something that wasn't human. I wanted to scream, to run, to bolt out of the bar and never look back, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear, trapped in the grip of something ancient and terrifying. The bar around me seemed to fade into the background, the patrons distant and blurred, their figures blending into the shadows. It was just me and her now, suspended in this moment of unbearable tension. And then, the cold draft vanished. The weight lifted. I blinked, slowly realizing that I was still sitting at the bar. I hadn't moved. The air around me felt warmer, the oppressive tension easing ever so slightly. My heart continued to race, but I could feel myself returning to reality, to the bar, to the present. She was gone. I didn't look to check. I didn't dare. But I could feel it, the change in the atmosphere. The weight of her presence had lifted, like a shadow retreating back into the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling from the encounter. I didn't know how I had survived it. All I knew was that I had followed the rule. I had made it through. The bartender approached me again, his expression unreadable as ever. "Good," he said quietly. "You didn't break the rule." I couldn't respond. I didn't have the energy. All I could do was nod weakly, my mind still reeling from the encounter. But before I could fully process what had just happened, the bartender leaned in close, his voice low and ominous. "There is one more rule," he whispered. "After midnight, the door cannot be opened from inside." My stomach dropped. The relief I had felt only moments ago evaporated, replaced by a new wave of terror. My heart pounded violently in my chest. The weight of those words settled over me like a suffocating blanket, my mind scrambling to make sense of it all. I was trapped. My hands clenched the edge of the bar, knuckles white as the dread coursed through me. I could feel the seconds ticking by, dragging me toward a decision I didn't want to make. Leave now? Break the second rule? The thought gnawed at me, growing louder with every beat of the clock. If you try to leave before the clock strikes 12, you'll find yourself unable to return to the life you knew. The bartender's voice had been cold and unyielding when he'd said it, but now it felt like a distant warning, almost mocking. What life? What was there for me, really? Sure, I'd just gotten this new job, but I didn't feel settled. My life before this city wasn't exactly something I was desperate to return to. Lonely nights in my quiet town, a few distant friends, and a lingering sense of dissatisfaction. I'd moved here hoping for something new, but now I wasn't sure. Was it better to just leave now and accept whatever consequence followed? Maybe what waited outside the bar couldn't be worse than the slow descent into madness I was feeling here. Time slipped through my fingers, and before I knew it, the bartender leaned in again. "It's almost midnight," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. My pulse quickened, panic surging through me. I couldn't decide. I couldn't think. The sound of the ticking clock filled my ears, relentless, unmerciful. And then, the clock chimed. Midnight. Everything froze. The soft chime of the clock echoed through the bar, dragging with it an almost unbearable silence. My mind reeled, spinning out of control. It was too late now, wasn't it? The clock had struck and I was trapped here. Trapped in this twisted, nightmarish place with rules that seemed designed to break me. I couldn't even muster a thought, my breathing shallow, my eyes darting around the bar. Then out of nowhere I heard it. The door creaked open behind me. My heart stopped. My mind raced, instantly recalling the sixth rule. If the entrance door opens on its own, don't look. But that door, that was my escape. The rules blurred in my mind, conflicting with my desperate need to leave. Who opened the door? How? The question echoed inside me, but the answer didn't matter. This was my chance. It had to be. A cold draft swept into the bar, chilling my skin. The air grew heavy, colder by the second. I could hear faint footsteps now, soft, deliberate, drawing closer. Each step seemed to reverberate inside my skull, as though the bar itself was amplifying the sound. Then the faintest hint of breathing, slow, steady, almost imperceptible. But there, something was there. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the primal urge to look behind me. Don't look, don't look. The cold grew more intense, creeping up my spine, as if a presence was looming right over my shoulder. I could feel it, standing just inches away, watching me. My legs trembled as I slowly slid off the bar stool. I had to move, had to get out before it was too late. My mind was screaming at me to run, to bolt for the door and never look back. But I forced myself to stay calm. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I was sure the whole bar could hear it. Then, I felt it, a light taps on my shoulder. The eighth rule pulsed in my head like a warning siren, urging me to ignore the icy fingers that had touched me. My heart was racing, my palms clammy, as I took a hesitant step toward the open door. The cold draft beckoned me, pulling me toward the exit, and yet the air felt thick, weighted down by the presence that was still just behind me. I couldn't look. I couldn't acknowledge it. The rules were all I had now. I took another step. The cold draft intensified, freezing my breath as it came out in shaky gasps. My feet felt heavy, like I was dragging them through a thick fog. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, the presence pressing down on me with every step I took toward the door. The tap on the shoulder came again, firmer this time. I swallowed hard, my vision swimming, but I didn't dare turn around. I kept my gaze locked ahead, my hands trembling as I reached for the door frame. I was so close. The cold wind was biting at my skin, the escape tantalizingly within reach. But there was something else now. A faint whisper, just behind me, so close it was almost like it was inside my head. Stay. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the overwhelming urge to listen, to turn and face whatever it was that lurked behind me. But I knew I couldn't. I had to leave. This was my only chance. I forced myself to take another step, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached the doorway, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. The footsteps behind me grew louder, and I could feel the presence almost breathing down my neck now. But I didn't stop. I took one last step and crossed the threshold. And then, silence. The cold disappeared in an instant. The suffocating weight lifted from my shoulders. My breath came out in short, ragged gasps as I stumbled forward, out of the bar and into the night. I blinked, disoriented, the darkness of the alley surrounding me. I was outside, but when I turned, there was nothing there. No sign of the door, no green light illuminating the alleyway. It was gone, like it had never existed. I stood there, my legs trembling, my body still shaking from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I checked my phone, my hands still shaking slightly. The screen lit up without issue now, the clock reading almost 5 a.m. Morning was approaching. It was over. I exhaled a long, shaky breath, half expecting to hear the sound of footsteps or the faint echo of the bartender's voice. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the city, the distant sound of traffic in the early hours of the morning. I took a few steps down the alleyway, glancing over my shoulder one last time. The alley was empty, just dark walls and shadows, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching. With one last glance at the empty space where the bar had been, I turned and walked into the night, the cold morning air biting at my skin. I didn't look back again. I escaped. If these stories creeped you out, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe for more spine-tingling content. Stay safe out there. And remember, sometimes the scariest things are hiding in plain sight. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.